Ethan Mercer pressed the letter into the fire before he finished reading it. He didn't need to. He already knew what it said. The bank had written the same words 3 times in 2 months. 30 days. Pay or surrender the deed. His hands didn't shake. His jaw didn't loosen. He just watched the paper curl black at the edges, and when there was nothing left but ash, he turned away and wrote the most desperate words of his entire life. Rancher, Wyoming, seeks wife, for practical arrangement only, no promises made, no love offered. He thought that was the lowest he could fall. He was wrong. The lowest came 6 weeks later when the train pulled in from the east, and the woman who stepped off it looked at his broken fence, his unpaid notices nailed to the post, and the hollowness in his eyes, and she didn't flinch, not once. He should have known then. A woman that fearless was either an answer to prayer or the beginning of something he wasn't ready for. If this story moves you, friends, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that notification bell so you never miss a chapter. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming. 1887 and find out what kind of woman answers a loveless advertisement in the dead of winter. The train was 40 minutes late. Ethan stood on the platform with his coat buttoned to the throat and his hat pulled low against the wind, and he told himself for the 4th time that he could still walk away. He could ride back to Red Hollow, nail the deed to the bank door, and be done with all of it. The land, the debt, the cold, all of it. He didn't walk away. He stood there in the snow, and he waited, because that was the one thing the war had never managed to beat out of him, the stubborn, stupid habit of staying when every instinct said, run. The engine came in slow and breathless, huffing great clouds of steam into the gray Wyoming afternoon, and Ethan counted the passengers as they stepped onto the platform. A traveling salesman with a trunk too big for one man. A family with 3 children who looked half frozen. An elderly preacher clutching a Bible to his chest, like it was the only warm thing he owned. And then last off the car, a woman in a dark wool coat carrying a single suitcase that had clearly seen better years. She was not what he expected. He didn't know exactly what he had expected. Something harder, maybe. Something worn all the way through by desperation, the kind of woman who answers advertisements because she has nowhere else to turn and no better options. He had pictured in his least charitable moments someone grateful enough to be quiet and obedient and ask nothing of him. What stepped onto the platform instead was a woman who stood straight as a fence post in a gale, scanned the platform with quick, precise eyes, and located him before he had taken a single step in her direction. She walked to him, not the other way around. "Mr. Mercer," she said, not a question. "Miss Reed." He touched the brim of his hat. "Train's late." 43 minutes, she said. There was ice on the tracks outside of Cheyenne. The crew handled it efficiently enough. She set her suitcase down in the snow and extended her hand. "Abigail Reed, it's good to meet you in person." He looked at her hand for half a second longer than was polite. Then he shook it. Her grip was firm, businesslike. She met his eyes without blinking, and Ethan had the uncomfortable feeling of being assessed by someone far more thorough than himself. "You have a wagon?" she asked. "Around the side. I'll get your bag." "I have it." She picked the suitcase back up before he reached for it. "It's not heavy." He let her keep it. He didn't know what else to do. They walked to the wagon in silence. Ethan climbed up onto the seat, favoring his left leg the way he always did when the cold had been sitting in his knee for too long, and she noticed. He saw her notice the quick flick of her eyes to his leg, the brief pause before she climbed up on her own side, but she said nothing about it. He was grateful for that at least. The drive back to the ranch took the better part of an hour, and for most of it neither of them spoke. Red Hollow was a town that had been promising itself a better future for 15 years and kept failing to deliver. The main street had 3 empty storefronts for every 2 that were still open. The church roof had a patch on it that had been temporary since 1882. Half the population had already followed the railroad money south, and the half that remained were the kind of stubborn that either became legend or became dust, and most days it was hard to tell which was which. Abigail Reed watched all of it as they drove through, and she didn't say a word. It wasn't until the ranch came into view, the main house, the sagging barn, the fence that had been waiting for replacement since before the last hard winter, that she finally spoke. "How much do you owe the bank?" she asked. Ethan's hands tightened on the reins. "That ain't your business yet, Miss Reed." "It will be," she said. "If we proceed. I'd rather know now." He kept his eyes on the road. $412, 60 days to clear it or they take the deed. She was quiet for a moment. "And your cattle?" "Lost about 2/3 last summer. Drought hit the eastern pastures hard. I've got enough head to rebuild if I can get through winter." "Feed situation?" "Tight. Hands?" "Had two. Let them go in October when the money ran out. It's just me." She nodded like he'd confirmed something she'd already calculated. "All right," she said. "Thank you for telling me." He glanced at her sideways. "You always ask a man his financials before you've had supper." "Only when his tax notices are nailed to his own fence post," she said mildly. His jaw tightened. He'd meant to take those down before she arrived. He'd forgotten, or maybe he'd just run out of the particular kind of energy it took to care about appearances when survival was taking everything he had. They pulled up in front of the house. He climbed down and reached up to help her, half expecting her to wave him off again. She didn't. She took his hand to step down from the wagon, let it go the moment her boots touched the ground, and then stood looking at the house for a long moment. He waited for her to say something about its condition. The weathered boards. The porch step that had cracked down the middle and been nailed back together twice already. The windows that let in more cold air than any window had a right to let in. She didn't say anything about the house. She said, "Where would you like me to put my things?" He showed her to the room he'd cleaned out, the one that had been his mother's a long time ago, when this place had been a different kind of home. He'd put clean sheets on the bed, and swept the floor, and set a candle on the windowsill, and now standing in the doorway, while she set her suitcase on the bed, he felt acutely aware of how thin the gesture was, how threadbare, how far from adequate. "It's not much," he said. "It's fine," she said. "Thank you." She began unbuttoning her coat. "I'll start supper if you'll show me where things are in the kitchen." "Miss Reed." He stopped himself, started over. "We ought to talk. About the arrangement, what you expect, what I—" He ran out of words. This was exactly why he'd put it in writing. He wasn't built for this kind of conversation. Abigail turned to look at him, coat half off her shoulders, her expression patient and direct and completely unfrightened. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I read your letter 3 times before I agreed to come. I understood what you were offering. I'm not here with any illusions." She paused. "Are you?" "No," he said. "Good." She finished taking her coat off and laid it across the foot of the bed. "Then we understand each other. We're 2 practical people in a difficult situation trying to find a workable solution. I have skills that may be useful to you. You have a home that needs someone to help keep it running. That seems like a reasonable basis to start from." "Skills," he repeated. "I can cook," she said. "I can keep accounts. I know how to manage a household budget and negotiate with suppliers. I'm a fast learner when it comes to things I don't know yet." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm not fragile, and I don't need to be managed. That's all you need to know about me for now." Ethan studied her for a moment. He'd hired ranch hands with less confidence than this woman carried in a single sentence. "Kitchen's at the end of the hall," he said. "Flour's in the tin on the left. There's salt pork in the cellar." He turned to go, then stopped. "Miss Reed." "Yes." "I appreciate plain speaking. Most people in this town waste half their breath on things they don't mean." He didn't look at her. "I'll try to do the same." "I'd appreciate that," she said. He nodded once and walked out. And supper that first night was salt pork and cornbread, and the kind of silence that isn't empty so much as careful. 2 people listening for the shape of each other without wanting to be caught at it. Ethan ate because his body required it. Abigail ate without complaint, which told him more than he expected it to. The women he'd known who came from eastern cities usually had opinions about frontier cooking. Loud ones. She simply ate, and when she was done, she refilled his coffee without asking, and then she sat back down and said, "The ledger on the shelf by the door, that's your accounts. What's left of them?" "May I look at it?" He pushed back from the table. "It ain't going to make you feel better." "It'll make me more useful," she said. He got the ledger. He slid it across the table to her. She opened it to the first page, and he watched her face as she began reading. The way her expression went carefully, professionally neutral in the way that meant she had found something she wasn't going to comment on until she was sure of it. "How long has it been since you reconciled these figures?" she asked. "I do it every month." "You do it as best you can," she said, not unkindly. "There are 3 consistent errors running through these calculations from last January onward." She turned the ledger so he could see. Each one is small, $5 here, $8 there. But they've been compounding for 11 months. She set her finger on a column. "You're showing yourself $41 deeper in debt than you actually are." He stared at the numbers. He had stared at those numbers 100 times, and they had always looked the same. "That's not possible," he said. "It's a carry error," she said. "Happens more than people think, especially when someone's keeping accounts under stress." She glanced up at him, brief and matter-of-fact. "You've been accurate. You've just been carrying the wrong starting figure for 11 months. Ethan sat very still. $41 was not a fortune. It would not save the ranch. But it was $41 he didn't think he had, and the knowledge of it, the knowledge that she had found it in 20 minutes after he'd been going blind, staring at the same pages for a year, did something complicated to the inside of his chest. "You're sure?" he said. "I'll double-check in the morning," she said. "But yes, I'm sure." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up, and it knocked against the house in gusts that rattled the window in its frame. The candle on the table flickered. "Where'd you learn bookkeeping?" he asked. She closed the ledger gently. "Boston. I worked in an office before I came west." She slid the book back across the table. "It's late. I'll do a full review tomorrow." She was closing the conversation. He recognized it, and he let her close it, because he had his own things he wasn't ready to talk about, and he figured they were even. He lay awake that night for a long time, looking at the ceiling, listening to the wind and the silence from the room at the end of the hall. He tried to remember the last time there had been another person breathing under this roof. It had been long enough ago that the memory had gone blurry at the edges. He thought about the ledger. He thought about her hands on the pages, quick, certain, turning to exactly the right column without hesitation. He thought about what it meant to be that sure of yourself in a stranger's house in the middle of winter, at the end of everything familiar. He didn't know what to make of Abigail Reed. That in itself was unusual. Ethan Mercer had spent enough years reading men, reading the kind of men who meant to take something from you. Reading the kind who were only barely holding themselves together. Reading the ones who'd do what they said, and the ones who wouldn't. That he'd long since stopped being surprised by people. He had a system, and the system had kept him alive, and he trusted it. The system had nothing useful to say about a woman who walked off a train in the middle of winter, found accounting errors in under half an hour, and refilled his coffee like it was a thing she'd been doing for years. He fell asleep eventually, and for the first time in 4 months, he didn't dream about the war. 3 days passed, then a week. The rhythm of the ranch shifted without Ethan quite understanding how it happened. Abigail was up before him every morning. He'd hear her in the kitchen, before he'd fully surfaced from sleep, the sounds of the stove being fed, the quiet domestic percussion of someone who knew how to move in a space without waking it up. She cooked without waste and without complaint, and what she couldn't make better, she made do, and she asked him questions about the ranch in the direct, functional way of someone making a mental map she intended to use. She reorganized the barn. He found out about it on the 4th day, when he went out to do his morning chores and discovered that the feed had been shifted to the right side wall, closer to the stall door, cutting 6 steps off the walk he made 40 times a day. He stood in the barn doorway, looking at the changed layout for a full minute. He hadn't asked her to do it. She hadn't mentioned it. He went back into the house. She was at the kitchen table with the ledger and a piece of paper covered in her neat, compact handwriting. "The barn," he said. She looked up. "I hope that's all right. The feed was on the wrong side for the way you moved through there, with your knee in cold weather." She stopped. "I should have asked first." "No," he said. "It's fine." He poured himself coffee and stood by the stove. "How'd you know it was my knee I never told you? The way you favor your left side changes when you've been standing in the cold for more than an hour," she said. "You compensate forward on that leg when you think nobody's watching." He looked at her. She had gone back to the ledger pencil, moving down the column with quiet precision. "You watch people pretty closely," he said. "Force of habit," she said, and didn't look up. He didn't push it. He was beginning to understand that Abigail Reed answered questions at the exact depth she chose, and not 1 inch deeper, and that if he wanted more than that, he was going to have to be patient. It was not a quality Ethan had ever particularly prided himself on. He was discovering he had more of it than he'd thought. On the 8th day, she rode into town without telling him. He noticed the horse gone around noon, and felt the first flicker of something he refused to identify as concern. She'd taken the gray mare, not the bay, which was the better horse, which meant she'd been paying attention to which one was more manageable. He told himself that was sensible. He told himself he had work to do. He did the work and kept looking at the road every 10 or 15 minutes, whether he meant to or not. She came back in the late afternoon, her cheeks red from the cold, the mare's saddlebags carrying a paper-wrapped parcel, and nothing else. "I went to see Harlan Griffith at the feed store," she said, handing him the mare's reins. "He's been charging you 14 cents a pound over the standard rate since last April." Ethan went very still. "What?" I asked to see his rate sheet. He was reluctant, but he showed me. She unwrapped the parcel. It was salt pork, a side of it more than he'd expected. "He adjusted your rate, and he made good on the difference in kind. It's not the full amount, but it's what he had on hand." She looked at Ethan's face. "I know I should have told you I was going. I'm sorry for that." "You went alone," he said. "Yes." "To argue with a man who's been cheating me for the better part of a year." "I didn't argue," she said. "I showed him the numbers. Numbers don't argue. They just sit there until someone has to reckon with them." Ethan stood in the cold, holding the mare's reins, and looking at this woman who had been in his house for 8 days and had already found him $41 in the ledger and 14 cents a pound from the feed store, and reorganized his barn to spare his bad knee, and he did not know what to say to any of it. "Abigail," he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. He hadn't planned it. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. Something shifted in her face. Not much, she was very controlled, he was learning that, but something. A brief, unguarded thing before she put the careful expression back in place. "You're welcome, Ethan," she said. They stood there for a moment in the late winter light, the cold between them feeling for the first time a little less like distance and a little more like the natural space between two people learning to trust the same ground. Then she took the salt pork and went inside, and he stood for a little while longer before leading the mare back to the barn. He didn't sleep as long as usual that night. He lay awake, and he thought about the fact that nobody had called him by his first name in close to 3 years. It sounded different than he remembered. The town had been watching. Of course the town had been watching. In a place the size of Red Hollow, 2 people sneezing in the same direction was worth discussing at the general store, and a mail-order bride arriving at the Mercer place to take on a dying ranch was the kind of story people were going to have opinions about whether you wanted them to or not. Most of those opinions arrived in the form of Ada Tolliver, who ran the dry goods store and considered herself the unofficial conscience of the community, and who appeared at Ethan's front door on the 9th morning with a covered dish and an expression of profound, cheerful, unstoppable nosiness. "Brought a pie," she announced when Abigail opened the door. "Apple? Are you Abigail?" "Of course you are. You look just like Ethan described." She smiled wide. "He said Boston. You look like Boston. Come on, honey, let's get acquainted." Ethan, who was in the barn and heard Ada's voice carrying across the yard, kept his head down and kept working. Ada Tolliver was a fact of life in Red Hollow, like wind and mud, and the way the church bell was always a little flat on the left side. There was no avoiding her. There was only waiting for her to finish. 20 minutes later, Abigail appeared in the barn doorway. "Your neighbor brought pie," she said. "Ada Tolliver. She seems—" Abigail paused, searching for the word. "Enthusiastic. That's one word for it." He kept his eyes on the harness he was mending. "She say anything to trouble you?" "She said the town's been worried about you." Abigail's voice was even. "She said you've been different since you came back from the war, that you stopped coming to town meetings, that you turned down help from the county relief fund last winter." "I don't take charity." "She didn't call it charity," Abigail said. "She called it community." He set the harness down. He looked at Abigail, who was leaning in the barn doorway with her arms folded, and her expression that same particular combination of direct and careful that he was beginning to know better than he'd intended. "There's something you want to say, Abigail?" "No," she said. "Not yet." She pushed off the door frame. "I'll heat up the pie for supper." He watched her walk back across the yard, her boots making clean prints in the snow, her back straight, and her pace steady, and her single worn suitcase. He thought of it suddenly, the way it had looked on that platform, the size of it against the size of everything she'd stepped into. And he thought that whatever Abigail Reed was running from or running toward, she was doing it with everything she had. He didn't know yet that someone was already watching her. That the man who had been quietly, methodically swallowing the land around Red Hollow for 2 years had seen the name on the train manifest, had recognized it, had begun very calmly to plan. Walter Bishop wasn't a man who raised his voice or made threats in public. He didn't have to. He had lawyers, and he had money, and he had patience, and in his experience, those 3 things together could accomplish anything that raw violence could with considerably less inconvenience. But he also had a memory, like a ledger, precise, permanent, and never once wrong. And the name Abigail Reed was written in that ledger. Had been for 3 years. He folded his newspaper. He looked out his window at the snow coming down over Red Hollow, at the lights beginning to come on in the houses along the main street, at the road that led east toward the Mercer ranch. He picked up his pen and wrote a single letter. The rancher had taken in a mail-order bride who had no idea in that moment that her past had just arrived in Wyoming before her. And everything was about to get very complicated. The letter Walter Bishop wrote that night arrived at the telegraph office in Red Hollow 3 mornings later, routed through Cheyenne with a return address that meant nothing to anyone in town except if she'd seen it to Abigail Reed. She didn't see it. She was at the ranch, elbow deep in Ethan's account books, and she had just found something that made her set her pencil down very carefully and stare at the wall for a long moment before she picked it up again. Ethan came in from the cold to find her. Like that still focused her jaw, set in a way he was beginning to recognize as the expression she wore when she was working through something she didn't want to say out loud yet. "What is it?" he asked. "Your water rights," she said. "The deed your father filed in 1871. Do you have a copy of it?" "Somewhere, in the box in the back room." He hung his coat and crossed to stand behind her, looking over her shoulder at the page she'd marked. "Why?" "Because someone has filed a competing claim," she said. 3 months ago. I found the reference in your county tax notification. It's buried in the 3rd paragraph of the 2nd page. Most people would never read that far." He went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. "Who filed it?" She turned to look at him. "A company called Meridian Land Holdings." The name meant nothing to him. He said so. "It wouldn't," she said. "It's designed not to. Companies like that exist on paper and in lawyers' offices." She turned back to the page. "Get me the deed, Ethan, and any other land documents your father left." He got the box. He set it on the table, and she went through it with the same swift, methodical precision he'd watched her apply to everything. Hands moving through papers with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for and exactly how documents like these were structured. He stood at the counter and drank his coffee and watched her work and felt the odd, uncomfortable sensation of being grateful and unsettled at the same time. "Here," she said, pulling a folded paper from the bottom of the box. "This is what they're contesting." She spread it flat and ran her finger down the language. "Your father's water rights attached to the Eastern Creek boundary. Whoever filed this competing claim is arguing the boundary notation is ambiguous." She looked up. "It's not ambiguous, but if you don't contest it within 60 days of the filing date—" "I lose the water," he said. "You lose the water," she confirmed. "And without the creek, your eastern pastures are worthless. You can't winter cattle without that water source." Ethan set his cup down. The sound of it was harder than he intended. 60 days from 3 months ago, he said. 30 days left, she said. Maybe less depending on when exactly the document was filed. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. 30 days. $60 in debt service coming due in less than that. A water rights contest he hadn't even known existed. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then looked back at Abigail, who was still looking at him with that steady, measured expression that refused to treat the situation as anything other than a problem to be solved. "What do I do?" he asked. It came out rougher than he meant it to. "You ride to the county land office in Casper," she said, "with this deed, and you file a formal response to the competing claim. You'll need a sworn affidavit attesting to continuous use of the water rights since 1871. She paused. "Can any of the older residents here confirm your family's use of that creek?" "Old Tom Hadley. He's been in Red Hollow since before my father built the first fence." "Good." She folded the deed back along its original creases. "Go see Tom Hadley today. Get his statement in writing. I'll draft the response filing tonight." She met his eyes. "We can beat this, Ethan, but only if we move fast." He stared at her. "You know how to draft a legal filing." "I know enough," she said, and reached for her pencil again. He rode to Tom Hadley's place that afternoon, and he got the statement, and when he came home, he found 3 pages of clean, precise legal language sitting on the kitchen table next to a plate of cornbread she'd kept warm for him in the oven. He read through the filing slowly, his lips barely moving, and every sentence was exactly right. Exactly the kind of language that didn't give an opposing lawyer anywhere to put a wedge. He sat down across from her. "Abigail," he said, "who taught you to write like this?" She was quiet for just a moment too long. "I told you, I worked in an office." "What kind of office?" She looked at him directly. "A legal one," she said. "For a time. It was a long time ago." She pushed the filing toward him. "You'll need to take that to Casper by Thursday to be safe. It's a long ride." He took the filing. He didn't push further, but the pause before her answer sat in the back of his mind the way a stone sits in a boot, small enough to ignore, impossible to forget. He left for Casper the next morning before dawn, and he told himself he'd be back by Thursday evening. He didn't think about the fact that riding alone in that kind of cold with a bad knee and a 2-day journey was exactly the kind of thing that had been killing him slowly before she arrived. He didn't think about it because there was no other option, and because he was a man who'd stopped expecting anyone to carry the load with him long enough ago that it simply didn't occur to him to wish for it. He was wrong about Thursday. What happened in his absence was this: Ada Tolliver came by again on Wednesday morning, and she wasn't alone. She brought Martha Briggs, whose husband ran the lumberyard, and Jenny Alcott, whose family had the second largest cattle operation in the county, and the 3 of them arrived with the particular energy of women who have decided to investigate something disguised as a social call. Abigail let them in. She served them coffee. She sat across from them at the kitchen table and was perfectly pleasant, and she answered every question they asked her: where she was from, how she and Ethan had corresponded, what she thought of Wyoming, with just enough information to be polite, and not one word more. And then Jenny Alcott set down her cup and said very sweetly, "You know, it's strange that you came all this way for a man like Ethan. I mean, he's a good man, but he's not well. He's not exactly easy." Abigail looked at her. "No," she said. "He isn't. He doesn't let people in," Ada said more kindly. We've been worried about him for years. Since he came back from the war, he just closed off. And we thought maybe a wife would help. But we also thought—" She stopped. "You thought she'd have to be the kind of woman who didn't ask for much," Abigail said. Ada had the grace to look a little embarrassed. "Well, I don't think that's what he needs," Abigail said. She said it simply without heat. "I think what he needs is someone who doesn't treat his silence like a problem to be fixed." She picked up her coffee cup. "He's not broken. He's careful. There's a difference." The three women exchanged a look. Jenny opened her mouth and closed it again. Martha Briggs, who had been quiet through all of it, leaned forward. "Where exactly in Boston did you say you were from, honey?" "Beacon Hill," Abigail said. "Originally." "And you worked in an office?" "For several years." "What firm?" The question landed and sat there in the quiet kitchen, and Abigail looked at Martha Briggs with an expression that was entirely pleasant and entirely closed, and she said, "A trading firm. Contracts and correspondence mostly. It wasn't very exciting." She set her cup down and stood up. "Can I get anyone more coffee?" The subject changed. But Martha Briggs watched Abigail for the rest of the visit with the focused, uneasy attention of a woman who has noticed something she can't quite name. Ethan came back Thursday evening stiff from the cold and the ride, and the 2 days of sleeping on a hard cot in Casper, and he walked into the house to find supper on the table and the kitchen warm and the filing stamped and confirmed in his saddlebag, and something inside him shifted in a way he immediately tried to shift back. "It's done?" she asked. "Filed and confirmed," he said. "Clerk said the competing claim was poorly documented. He seemed confident we'd prevail." She let out a slow breath. "Good." "You did the hard part," he said, "writing that filing." "You rode 2 days in the cold to deliver it," she said. "That's not nothing." He sat down at the table, and she poured his coffee, and he watched her hands, the efficient, unhurried way she moved, never a wasted motion. And he thought about what Ada had told him she'd said. He'd stopped at Ada's on the way back through town, because Ada was impossible to avoid, and occasionally useful. And Ada had told him with the gleeful precision of someone delivering important information exactly what had been said in his kitchen on Wednesday morning. He thinks what he needs is someone who doesn't treat his silence like a problem to be fixed. He's not broken. He's careful. He hadn't known what to do with that. He still didn't. "Martha Briggs came by while you were gone," Abigail said, sitting down across from him. "I heard." She looked at him. "She asked questions I didn't answer completely." "I know Martha Briggs. She'll ask them again." "I know." Abigail folded her hands on the table. "When she does, I'll handle it." He looked at her. "You sure about that?" "Yes," she said. And her voice had that quality again, the one that was absolutely certain and absolutely private at the same time, like a door that was shut but not locked. He ate his supper. She ate hers. And then he said, without planning to, "The first spring after my father died, I almost lost this place. That was 1879. I was 24, and I didn't know half of what I thought I knew, and the bank was already sending letters." He looked at his plate. "A man named Samuel Reeves came out from Casper and offered to buy me out. Said I couldn't save it. Said I was too young and too green, and the land wasn't worth what my father had paid for it anyway." She was quiet, listening. He could feel her listening. "I told him to get off my property," he said, "and I spent the next 3 years proving he was wrong." He paused. "I was thinking about that riding back, about what it cost to prove him wrong, how much of myself I had to spend just staying." Abigail didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "What made you place the advertisement?" He looked up. "What?" "The advertisement. In the papers. What finally made you do it?" He was quiet. It was a longer quiet than it should have been, and he knew she noticed, and he gave her the truth, because he'd promised plain speaking, and he intended to keep that promise, even when it was inconvenient. "I came in from the east pasture one January evening," he said, "and I walked into this house, and it was dark and cold and quiet, and I stood in the middle of the kitchen, and I thought—" He stopped, started again. I thought if I fell out there tomorrow, it'd be 3 days before anybody came looking. Maybe 4. He looked at the table. I wasn't afraid of dying exactly. I was afraid of nobody noticing. The kitchen was very quiet. Abigail reached across the table and touched the back of his hand, just one brief light touch there, and gone before he could respond to it, and she said, "I would have noticed." He looked at her. She was looking at him steadily, without the careful, controlled expression she usually wore, and what was in her face instead was something simpler and more honest, and he didn't have a word for it. He'd been without words for a long time. "Abigail, you should sleep," she said, pulling her hand back. "You've been riding for 2 days." He went to bed. He lay there for a long time, his hand on the quilt, and he thought about 3 words. I would have noticed. He thought about the weight of them. The specific, particular weight of being told for the first time in years that your presence on this earth would register with another human being if it stopped. He did not think he was falling in love. He was not the kind of man who fell. But he thought, maybe slowly, carefully, he was beginning to lean. The thing about Walter Bishop was that he was patient. He had not become the most powerful land developer in Wyoming by rushing. He waited until conditions were right, until his targets were tired and off balance, and then he moved not with force, but with paperwork. With the slow legal suffocation of a man who understood that the most devastating thing you could do to a struggling rancher was not to threaten him openly, but to simply file enough documents that he spent all his time responding to them. He had done this to 11 ranchers in Laramie County in the past 2 years. 9 of them had sold. 2 had walked away with nothing. He had planned to do the same to Ethan Mercer, and he had been patient about it, filing the water rights claim 3 months ago and waiting for the 60-day window to close. Then Abigail Reed had walked off that train, and the water rights filing had been answered precisely, completely correctly within 30 days. Bishop sat across from his attorney in the back room of the Red Hollow land office, which he had rented for the week, and he read the response filing twice slowly. "She wrote this," he said. The attorney shifted in his chair. "We can't prove that." "I don't need to prove it," Bishop said. "I know it." He set the filing down on the desk. "She was at Hartwell and Associates for 4 years. She handled land contract disputes for the railroad. She knows every trick we have Caldwell because we're the ones who taught them to her." He looked up. "Why is she in Red Hollow?" "She answered a marriage advertisement," the attorney said, "as far as we can determine." "She answered a marriage advertisement," Bishop repeated slowly, "and the first thing she does is find a water rights filing buried in a tax notification and counter it inside 30 days. He was quiet for a moment. "She's not hiding here, Caldwell. She's hunting." The attorney looked uncomfortable. "Hunting for what?" Bishop stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked out the window at the main street of Red Hollow, at the small, stubborn, fraying life of a town that had no idea what was coming for it. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I intend to find out." He picked up his hat. "Quietly, please. I want her watched, not approached, just watched." He walked out into the cold Wyoming air, and 2 blocks away, behind the curtain of the general store window, Martha Briggs watched him go, and then turned back to the counter and picked up the letter she'd been holding when he walked past the window. It was addressed to someone in Boston. She'd written it herself this morning after she'd spent the night thinking about the way Abigail Reed had answered her questions. About what she'd said, and what she'd been very careful not to say. Martha Briggs was nobody's fool. She'd lived in Red Hollow for 30 years, and she knew the difference between a woman starting over and a woman running. Abigail Reed, she suspected, was both. And whatever she was running from had just ridden into town in a good suit and a rented office. It was Martha Briggs who started it. Not out of malice, Ethan understood that later, when he had enough distance to be fair about it, but out of the particular kind of small-town protectiveness that sometimes looks identical to cruelty from the inside of it. She came to the ranch on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Bishop had arrived in Red Hollow, and she asked to speak to Ethan alone. He should have sent her away. He didn't. Abigail was in the back room going through the winter feed calculations, and Ethan stood in the kitchen with Martha Briggs and listened to what she had to say, and by the time she finished, he had gone very still in the way that he only went still when something had hit him somewhere he didn't know was unprotected. "I wrote to a contact in Boston," Martha said. She had the decency to look uncomfortable about it. "A woman I know whose husband works in the courthouse district. I asked her to look into Abigail Reed." She set a folded letter on the kitchen table. "Ethan, she wasn't just a clerk in a legal office. She worked for 4 years at a firm called Hartwell and Associates. Do you know who Hartwell and Associates represents?" He didn't. He looked at the letter, but didn't pick it up. "They're the primary legal counsel for Continental Railroad," Martha said. "Continental is one of the companies that's been buying up land across Wyoming for the past 3 years, buying or taking depending on who you ask." She paused. "Bishop's land operation Meridian Holdings is a subsidiary, a shell company. It exists to do the dirty work so Continental's name never appears on anything that goes to court." The kitchen was so quiet, Ethan could hear the fire in the stove. "She knew Bishop," Martha said, "or knew of him. She would have processed documents, contracts, land acquisition filings, the same kinds of filings that are being used against ranchers all across this territory." She looked at Ethan with something that was genuinely sorry. "I thought you had a right to know." He picked up the letter. He read it slowly. Martha waited. When he set it back down, his face was the face he'd learned to wear in the war, closed and flat, and telling nothing. "Thank you, Martha," he said. "I'll see you out." She left. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment, the letter on the table between his hands, and he listened to the sound of Abigail moving in the back room, the rustle of papers, the scratch of her pencil, the small, ordinary sounds of a woman doing work that had already saved his ranch twice over. He folded the letter. He put it in his coat pocket. He went outside and he split wood for an hour, which was what he did when he needed to think without his face giving him away. She knew. She had to have known. She came here knowing exactly who owned this land, and exactly what it was worth, and exactly what was being done to it, and she had never said a word. The question that hit him hardest, the one he kept swinging back to, no matter how many times he tried to lay it down, was not what she'd done. It was why she'd come. He didn't ask her that night, or the night after. He ate supper across from her, and answered her questions about the eastern fence line, and listened to her talk through the feed budget numbers, and said nothing about the letter, and he hated himself for the distance that opened up in him over those 2 days. The careful, deliberate pulling back that he recognized because he'd been doing it to people his whole adult life. She noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything. On the second night, she set her fork down and looked at him across the table and said, "What happened?" He looked at her. "2 days ago, you were different," she said. "Since Thursday morning, you've been—" She stopped. "Did Martha Briggs say something to you?" He reached into his coat pocket and laid the letter on the table between them. She looked at it. She didn't pick it up. She didn't have to. The return address was enough. He watched her face, and what he saw there was not surprise. What he saw was something that looked more like a woman watching a wave she'd known was coming finally arrive on shore. "How long did you work for Hartwell and Associates?" he asked. 4 years, she said. "I left in the spring of 1884. "Why?" She looked at him directly. "Because I found out what some of the filings I was processing were actually being used for. Land acquisition schemes. Fraudulent boundary contests. The same kind of thing being done to you." She paused. "When I understood what I had been part of, I resigned." "And then you answered a marriage advertisement in Wyoming," he said. His voice was level. He was working very hard to keep it level. "From a man whose land is being targeted by the same company you used to work for." She held his gaze. "Yes. That's a remarkable coincidence, Abigail." "It isn't a coincidence," she said. The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. He sat back in his chair. "Say that again." "I came to Red Hollow because of the land scheme," she said, and her voice was steady, and her hands were flat on the table, and she looked at him like a woman who has decided the only way through is straight. "I knew Continental had targeted this valley. I knew Meridian Holdings had filed false competing claims on at least 4 properties here, including yours. I came because I know how they operate, and I know how to stop them, and I needed to be here to do it." She paused. "Your advertisement was—" She hesitated for the first time. "It was an opportunity. For both of us. I thought—" Ethan stood up. He crossed to the window and stood with his back to her, and the silence in the room was the loudest thing he'd heard since the war. "You used me," he said. "I helped you," she said quietly. "Those are different things." "Are they?" It wasn't a question. "Ethan, you've been in this house for 6 weeks," he said. "You found my accounting errors, and you fixed my water rights filing, and you reorganized my barn, and you sat across from me at this table every night, and you never once told me the truth." "No," she said. "I didn't." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm telling it now." He turned around. He looked at her sitting at his kitchen table, her hands still flat and still, her face open in a way he'd never seen it before. No careful expression, no controlled distance. Just the plain and undefended truth of her, and it made him angrier than the deception had somehow, because it meant she was real, and it meant he'd been right about her, and he didn't know what to do with both of those things at once. "You need to tell me everything," he said. "All of it, right now." She told him. For an hour she talked, and he stood, and then sat, and then stood again, and she laid out the whole shape of it, the years at Hartwell, the filings. She hadn't understood at first the moment she'd pulled a land survey for a property in Nebraska, and recognized that the boundary notation had been altered after the original survey, and the slow, terrible understanding that had followed. The internal complaint she'd filed that had gone nowhere. The partner who had called her into his office and suggested very pleasantly that she consider her future employment prospects carefully before pursuing the matter. She had left. She had taken nothing with her, nothing she wasn't entitled to except the knowledge of how they worked, the language they used, the specific legal vulnerabilities in the schemes they ran. "I kept copies," she said, "of certain documents, the ones that showed the pattern most clearly. I have them." She met his eyes. "They're the kind of documents that, presented to the right court, would dismantle Continental's entire Wyoming operation." He stared at her. "Where are they?" "Somewhere safe," she said. "Not here." "Abigail." His voice was rough. "Are you telling me you came to Red Hollow carrying evidence against the most powerful railroad company in the territory, and you moved into my house and you didn't think I had a right to know any of this?" She flinched. It was the first time he'd seen her flinch. "Yes," she said. "That's what I'm telling you." He walked out of the kitchen. He didn't slam the door. He just walked out through the back and into the cold, and he stood in the dark and breathed until the thing in his chest settled enough that he could think. She'd lied. By omission, by strategy, by careful silence, she'd lied. And the ranch was safer for it, and the water rights were secured for it, and he had slept better in the past 6 weeks than he had in 3 years. And none of that changed the lie. But it also didn't change what she'd said across the table. "I'm telling it now." He went back inside after 20 minutes. She was still at the table. She hadn't moved. "I need time," he said. "I know," she said. "Don't go anywhere," he said. "Not yet." Something moved in her face. "All right," she said. He went to bed. He didn't sleep. The town meeting was Bishop's idea. Ethan found out about it the way you found out about most things in Red Hollow, which was through Ada Tolliver, who appeared at the ranch gate the next morning, with the specific energy of a woman carrying news she hasn't decided whether to be horrified or excited about. "Walter Bishop has called a public meeting," she said, breathless from the ride. "Tonight, at the church hall. He's saying he has information about—" She glanced past Ethan toward the house. "About your wife. Ethan, I don't know what he's planning, but half the town's already talking." Ethan felt something cold and decisive settle in the center of him. "Tell me exactly what he said," Ada told him. Bishop had gone door to door that morning, or rather his attorney Caldwell had informing key members of the community that a woman with a troubling history had arrived in Red Hollow under false pretenses, and that the public deserved to know the truth about who was living among them. He's going to expose her, Ethan said. He's going to try, Ada said carefully. Ethan, a lot of people are already going to show up just to hear what he has to say. You know how this town is? He knew exactly how this town was. He went inside and he told Abigail. She went very still. Then she nodded once the way someone nods when they've been expecting a blow and it has finally landed, and she said, I see. We don't have to go, he said. Yes, we do, she said. If we don't go, whatever he says goes unanswered. She stood up from the table. I need an hour. He didn't ask what for. He gave her the hour. The church hall was packed. Ethan hadn't seen that many people in one room since the county harvest fair 2 years ago, and the energy was different from a fair tighter, more uncertain, the particular charged quality of a crowd that has come expecting to be told something and isn't sure yet whether it will be glad or sorry. Bishop stood at the front of the room like a man who had done this before, which he had. He was unhurried. He was pleasant. He thanked everyone for coming and said he understood it was short notice and hoped they'd bear with him because what he had to share was important for the well-being of the entire community. Ethan stood at the back with Abigail beside him. She was very quiet. Her face was the controlled, careful expression again, but underneath it, close enough that he could feel it was something else. Something that was not fear exactly. Something older than fear. Bishop laid it out methodically. Abigail Reed, now Mercer. He acknowledged with a small, regretful smile had been employed for 4 years by Hartwell and Associates Legal Counsel to Continental Railroad. During her time there, she had processed and filed dozens of documents that had been used to dispossess struggling ranchers across Nebraska, Colorado, and Wyoming. He had affidavits. He had former colleagues of hers who would testify to the nature of her work. He paused. He looked out at the crowd. I am not here to condemn this woman, he said with the practiced compassion of a man who is absolutely here to condemn this woman. I simply believe that the people of Red Hollow have a right to know who is living in their community. And I believe that Ethan Mercer, who has struggled so valiantly to hold on to his family's land, that Continental has had absolutely no involvement in targeting, I want to be very clear, deserves to know the full truth about the woman he married. The murmur that moved through the crowd was the worst sound Ethan had ever heard in a room full of people he knew. He felt heads turning toward him. He felt the weight of collective judgment landing like weather, not violent, just heavy, the kind of pressure that doesn't break things so much as slowly, inexorably bow them. Abigail stood straight beside him. Tom Hadley, who was 81 years old and had known Ethan's father and did not especially care for men in good suits, said from the third row, That's a real fine speech, Mr. Bishop. You got anything that ain't a speech? A few people laughed. The tension in the room shifted slightly. Bishop smiled. I have affidavits from 3 former colleagues of Mrs. Mercer's, Mr. Hadley, confirming her employment and the nature of her work I worked at Hartwell and Associates for 4 years. Abigail said. Her voice carried. She didn't raise it. She just spoke clearly, and the room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when someone says the exact thing nobody expected them to say. Every head turned to her. She walked forward through the crowd, and people stepped back to make space, and she came to stand in the center of the room where everyone could see her, and she looked at Walter Bishop with an expression that was clear and level and entirely without apology. Everything Mr. Bishop has told you about my employment is true, she said. I worked there. I processed those filings. And when I understood what those filings were actually being used for, when I understood that the legal work I was doing was being used to strip families of land they'd held for generations, I left. She let that sit for a moment. I did not come to Red Hollow to hide from that. I came here because I knew what was being done to this valley, and I knew how to stop it. She turned to look at the crowd at Ada Tolliver, with her hand pressed to her mouth, at Tom Hadley, leaning forward in his chair, at Jenny Alcott and Martha Briggs, and the 20 other faces she'd been learning for 6 weeks. Walter Bishop's company has filed false land claims on 4 properties in this valley, she said. Not just Ethan's, 4. I have documentation of each one. I have evidence that Meridian Holdings is a shell company created specifically to conduct land acquisitions that Continental Railroad doesn't want attached to their name. She looked directly at Bishop. and I intend to present that evidence in Laramie County District Court." The room erupted. Bishop's expression didn't change. That was the thing that told Ethan everything he needed to know about the man. The absence of surprise. He'd expected this. He'd wanted this. He'd wanted her out in the open, making claims in public because a woman making public accusations was easier to discredit than documents filed quietly in the right court. "Mrs. Mercer," Bishop said over the noise with a kind of magnanimous patience that made Ethan's hands close into fists at his sides. "I think the people of Red Hollow can see very clearly what's happening here. A woman with a troubled past is trying to rehabilitate herself at the expense of this community's trust. That's a story we've all seen before." "What documentation?" someone called from the crowd. "She said she has documentation, let's see it." "It's not here," Abigail said. "It's being held securely, for obvious reasons." The murmur shifted again, less certain now, more suspicious, the particular sound of people who want to believe something and aren't sure they should. Ethan moved. He crossed the room and came to stand beside her, and he was aware of every eye tracking him, and he didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Walter Bishop. "You've been filing fraudulent land claims in this valley for 2 years, he said. "I know it, she knows it. And if half of what she's carrying can be proven in court, you know it too." He let the silence sit for a moment. "This meeting is over." Bishop smiled the smile of a man who has already made the move he intended to make and is perfectly happy with how it landed. "Of course, Ethan. You have a good evening." He picked up his hat. "We'll let the community make up their own minds." He walked out. Caldwell followed. The room stayed loud for a long time after. Some people came to Ethan. Some people left without speaking. Martha Briggs stood by the door and looked at Abigail with an expression that was somewhere between remorse and uncertainty, and she didn't say anything, and Abigail didn't look at her. They rode home in the dark side by side, the horses picking their way carefully through the cold. Halfway back, Abigail said, "I'm sorry." Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "For which part?" "For not telling you sooner," she said. "For putting you in that room without warning you first." A pause. "For all of it." He was quiet for a long time. The horses moved. The stars were out hard and bright and indifferent. "You said the evidence is being held securely," he said. "Yes." "Where?" She looked at him. "A lockbox at the Casper Territorial Bank. Under a name Bishop won't recognize." She paused. "I set it up before I left Boston, before I came west. It was the first thing I did." He absorbed that, the planning of it, the deliberateness of it. A woman who had resigned from her position gathered what she needed, set up a dead drop in Wyoming, and then answered a marriage advertisement to get herself into position. "You planned all of this," he said. "Yes," she said, "before you knew anything about me." "Yes." She held his gaze. "I chose your advertisement because your land was the most recently targeted, and because the water rights filing was the most fraudulent, and because—" She stopped. "Because why?" She looked away. "Because your letter sounded like a man who was running out of time and still hadn't given up," she said quietly. "And I needed someone like that." Ethan looked at the road ahead of them. At the dark shape of the ranch coming up in the distance, the one light burning in the kitchen window that he'd left on when they went. He thought about a man who splits wood alone in the dark for 3 years and calls it survival. He thought about a woman who memorizes a train schedule and opens a bank account in a false name and rides into a dying town with one suitcase because she has decided that justice is worth the cost of everything comfortable. He thought about how neither of them had been planning on the other being real. "Get some sleep," he said when they reached the barn. "We're going to Casper in the morning." She looked at him. "Ethan?" "Get the evidence," he said. "That's the next step. Everything else." He stopped. He looked at her in the dark, and what he felt was not simple, and it was not resolved, and it was not going to be resolved tonight. "Everything else we'll figure out after." She nodded. She took her horse into the barn. He stood in the cold for a moment looking up at the sky. Somewhere in town, Walter Bishop was sitting in his rented office, calculating, planning the next move with the same patient, methodical intelligence that had already destroyed 9 families and taken 11 pieces of land. And he didn't know, couldn't know not yet, that the woman he'd just publicly exposed had been 10 steps ahead of him since before she'd ever set foot in Wyoming. But Bishop wasn't the only problem anymore. When Ethan went to check the eastern fence line before bed, he found it, freshly cut wire. And beyond it, where his water supply ran down from the creek into the eastern pasture, a line of new posts set into the frozen ground. Someone had started fencing off his water in the night. Ethan didn't sleep. He stood at the eastern fence line in the dark, with a lantern in one hand, and counted the posts, 12 of them, driven into frozen ground with the kind of professional efficiency that told him this hadn't been done by amateurs or drunks or opportunists. This had been planned, surveyed, executed while half the town was sitting in the church hall, listening to Walter Bishop give his careful, regretful speech about the troubled woman at the Mercer ranch. The speech had been a distraction. The fence line was the real move. He went back to the house and he woke Abigail. She was alert before he finished the second knock, which told him she hadn't been sleeping either. She opened the door in her coat over her nightgown, her hair loose, her eyes already asking the question before he said a word. "They fenced the creek," he said. She stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Show me." He showed her. She walked the line of posts in the dark, with the lantern held low, not saying anything. Looking at the ground, looking at the angle of the fence, looking at the direction it was running. He watched her work it out, the geography of it, the legal implications of it, and he could see the moment she understood, because her jaw tightened, and she turned to look at him with something in her face that was anger and recognition at the same time. "This isn't a competing claim," she said. "They're not even pretending to file a legal challenge this time. They're just physically enclosing the water source and daring you to remove it." "Because they know I don't have the money to fight it in court," he said. "Because they know that by the time a court orders removal, the damage to your cattle operation will already be done," she said. "Even if you win, you lose a season, maybe 2. She set the lantern down in the snow. "This is what they do when the legal approach takes too long. They move the problem into the physical world and make you spend money you don't have to undo it. So what do I do?" She looked at him. "Nothing. Not tonight. Tonight you go back to the house and you sleep, because tomorrow is going to be the longest day of your life. And I need you functional." She picked up the lantern. "I need to send a telegram. First thing in the morning." "To who?" "The United States Marshal's office in Cheyenne," she said. "And a federal land commissioner I know in Denver. And a reporter at the Casper Tribune who has been trying to write this story for 2 years and couldn't get enough documentation to publish it." She started walking back toward the house. "The documentation exists now. It's sitting in a lockbox in Casper. And as of tonight, we have physical evidence of illegal enclosure to add to it." He fell into step beside her. "You've been planning this longer than I thought." "I've been waiting for the moment when it would matter most," she said. "Bishop just handed it to me. The church meeting, the public accusations, the fence line, all of it in one night. He moved too fast because he was worried about what I might do next." She glanced at him sideways. "He should have been." Ethan looked at her in the lantern light. Her hair loose around her face, her expression set with a clear and purposeful anger he hadn't seen in her before, and something else underneath it. Something that had been there since the church hall and hadn't left. The look of a woman who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has finally put it down in the right place. "Abigail," he said. She looked at him. "I'm glad you came," he said. "Whatever else is true, I'm glad you came." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away back toward the house and she said quietly, "So am I." They rode to Casper before dawn. The lockbox was exactly where she said it would be, a plain iron box at the Territorial Bank, signed out under the name Catherine Moore, which was her mother's name, and which Bishop's people would never in 1,000 years have thought to look for. The teller brought it out and set it on the counter, and Abigail opened it with a key she'd been carrying in the lining of her coat since Boston, and Ethan looked at what was inside. 47 documents, maybe more. He couldn't count them all from where he stood. Land surveys with boundary notations that had been altered in a different ink. Purchase agreements with dates that didn't match the public filings. Internal correspondence between Continental Railroad's board of directors and the management of Meridian Holdings, laying out the acquisition strategy in language that was almost admirably direct for men who ought to have known better than to put such things in writing. "How did you get these?" he asked. "Copies are made in triplicate in a legal office," she said, sorting through them with the focused efficiency of a woman who has reviewed each one so many times she has them memorized. "The third copy goes to an archive. I was the archivist." She looked up at him. "I made a fourth copy of the relevant ones before I left." "They know you took them. They suspected," she said. "They couldn't prove it." She pulled a specific document from the stack and held it out to him. "This one is the most important. It's a letter from Continental's chief legal officer to the director of Meridian Holdings. It specifically authorizes in writing with a signature the use of false boundary surveys as a legal strategy for acquisition." She tapped the signature at the bottom. "That man is currently a candidate for the Wyoming Territorial Legislature." Ethan looked at the letter. He looked at the signature. He looked at Abigail. "You've been sitting on this," he said slowly, "since 1884. "I've been waiting for the right moment and the right place," she said. "You need to understand taking on Continental Railroad with documents alone is not enough. I needed a local incident, a visible documented fresh violation that would give the federal marshal grounds to intervene." She set the letter down. "The fence line last night is that incident." "So you needed me," he said. "Yes," she said. "I needed your land, your situation, your documented history of harassment." She met his eyes, and she did not look away, and her voice was steady. "I also need you to know that somewhere along the way, that stopped being the whole of it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the documents and said, "Let's go find your federal land commissioner." The commissioner's name was Hargrove, and he was in Denver, and they couldn't reach him in person before the situation in Red Hollow moved faster than any of them anticipated. Because Bishop wasn't done. The telegram arrived at the Red Hollow post office on Friday afternoon, and the postmaster, who was a gossip but not a dishonest man, brought it personally to Ada Tolliver because Ada was closest, and because the contents of it alarmed him enough that he didn't want to be responsible for it alone. The telegram was from Continental Railroad's legal office in Chicago. It was addressed to Walter Bishop, and it had been sent in error to Red Hollow instead of to Bishop's private office in Casper, and what it said in the clipped, efficient language of men who trusted encryption and received instead a misfiled wire was that the acquisition timeline for the Red Hollow Valley properties needed to be accelerated, and that if the Reed woman could not be neutralized through public discrediting, other measures should be considered. Other measures. Ada Tolliver read that phrase 3 times, and then she saddled her horse and she rode to the Mercer ranch faster than she had ridden anywhere in 10 years. Ethan and Abigail had been back from Casper for less than an hour when Ada arrived. She came in breathless and red-faced and handed the telegram to Abigail without preamble. Abigail read it. She read it twice. Then she looked at Ethan. "This changes the timeline," she said. "How bad?" he asked. "If they're authorizing other measures, it means they're willing to move outside legal channels." She set the telegram on the table. "We need to get the documents to the federal marshal in Cheyenne today. Not next week. Today." Ada, still catching her breath by the door, said, "There's something else." She looked between the two of them. "Tom Hadley came to see me this morning. He's been talking to the other ranchers. Bishop has filed claims against the Reardon place, the Alcott's eastern parcel, the Brennan homestead. They've all been sitting on this because they didn't think they could fight it alone." She paused. "Tom says if Ethan moves, they'll move with him. All of them." The room was quiet. Ethan looked at the telegram. He looked at Abigail. He looked at Ada, who had ridden here at a dead gallop, at no small personal effort, and he thought about the version of himself that had stood in this kitchen alone for 3 years and believed that asking for help meant failing. "Tell Tom we move Monday," he said. "If he can get the others to Casper by Monday, Abigail can file a consolidated complaint. Multiple properties, multiple violations. That's a federal case, not a county one. Ada almost smiled. He's going to be pleased to hear that. She pulled her coat back on. Ethan, for what it's worth. She looked at Abigail. I was wrong to question you. I'm sorry. Abigail nodded once. Thank you for riding out Ada. It mattered. Ada left. Ethan looked at Abigail across the kitchen. Monday, she said. We need to organize everything by Monday. Can we do that in 3 days? We don't have a choice, she said. They worked through the night. Ethan had not seen anything like it, the way she moved through those 47 documents, sorting and cross-referencing, and building the structure of an argument with the same systematic precision she'd applied to his accounting ledger. Except this time, what she was building was a federal case against one of the most powerful railroad companies in America. She wrote in a clear, precise hand that didn't waver even at 2 a.m. She organized the evidence into 3 categories: fraudulent survey alterations, illegal acquisition directives, and physical enclosure violations. And she drafted a consolidated complaint that laid out the full scope of Continental's Wyoming operation in language simple enough that any federal judge could follow it. Ethan made coffee and kept the fire and stayed across the table from her and read through documents she handed him and answered questions about his own property records, and did not think about the fact that watching her work was the most extraordinary thing he had witnessed in years. Around 3 a.m, she set her pencil down and pressed both hands over her eyes for a moment. He pushed a cup of coffee toward her without saying anything. She took it. She wrapped her hands around it and stared at the table. When this is over, she said, if it works, what happens to us? He looked at her. He'd been expecting the question. He hadn't expected it at 3 a.m, with 47 documents between them on the kitchen table. What do you want to happen? He asked. She looked up at him. I asked you first. He thought about it honestly, the way he'd been thinking about it for 6 weeks. About the man who'd put a notice in the paper because he was afraid of dying unnoticed, and the woman who'd read it and gotten on a train, and everything that had accumulated between them since the coffee cups and the ledger errors, and the barn reorganization, and the lantern at the eastern fence line, and the 3 words she'd said in the dark on the way home from the church. So am I. I'd like you to stay, he said. Not because of the ranch, not because of any of this. He gestured at the documents. Just because I don't want to go back to eating supper alone. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face went very quiet and very still, and then she picked up her pencil and said, Let me finish this filing. He smiled, though she wasn't looking. He didn't think he'd smiled in the kitchen in close to 4 years. Monday came gray and cold and full of wind off the mountains, and they rode into Casper with 7 ranchers behind them. Ethan and Abigail in the lead, then Tom Hadley and his son, then Patrick Reardon, then the Brennan brothers, then Jenny Alcott riding alone because her husband was sick, but she'd come anyway. 7 families. 7 separate violations. 7 different properties targeted by the same company, using the same methods documented in the same 47 pieces of evidence that Abigail carried in a leather satchel against her body the entire ride. The Federal Land Commissioner's office was not large. Hargrove himself was a compact, methodical man of 50, with the particular patience of someone who has been doing difficult paperwork in difficult places for a long time. And when Abigail laid the consolidated complaint on his desk, and he began reading, the room went very quiet. He read for 20 minutes without speaking. Nobody moved. Then he looked up and said, Miss Reed, Mrs. Mercer, where did you obtain these internal directives? I made authorized copies during my employment, she said. The authorization was part of my standard archival duties. The copies are legal. Continental will argue otherwise. Continental can argue whatever they like, she said. The question is whether the evidence is credible. I believe it is. I believe you do too. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the 7 people standing behind her. Then he looked back at the documents. I'm going to need a week, he said. You have until Thursday, Abigail said. If Continental's men are authorized to move outside legal channels against these families, we don't have the luxury of a week." He looked at her sharply. She laid the misfiled telegram on top of the stack. He read it. He set it down very carefully. "Thursday," he said. Bishop moved on Wednesday. Nobody had expected Wednesday. They'd been watching for legal maneuvers for injunctions for more filings, the paper war that Bishop had always preferred. What came instead was 3 men on horseback at the Riordan place at midnight, cutting fence wire and driving 40 head of cattle off the eastern pasture. Patrick Riordan's youngest son was 16, and he heard them from the house, and he came out with a rifle, and one of Bishop's men knocked him down and left him in the snow. The boy wasn't seriously hurt, but the message was clear. Ethan got word by dawn. He rode to the Riordan place and helped Patrick get the boy inside, and looked at the cut fence and the cattle tracks disappearing east, and he felt something that had been building in him for 20 years finally reach its limit. He rode to Casper, straight to Hargrove's office. He walked in without knocking, and he said, "They put a 16-year-old boy in the snow last night. Tell me, Thursday still means Thursday." Hargrove looked up from the documents spread across his desk. "Sit down, Mr. Mercer." "I don't want to sit down." "Sit down anyway." Hargrove folded his hands. "I filed the federal complaint this morning, 3 hours ago. The U.S. Marshal has been notified and is riding from Cheyenne. Continental Railroad's Wyoming operation is under federal investigation as of today." He held Ethan's gaze. "We moved to Tuesday night when the telegram came in. We didn't wait for Thursday." Ethan stood very still. "Where's Bishop?" he asked. "His attorney filed an appearance in Laramie County District Court this morning," Hargrove said. "He's trying to get ahead of the federal complaint with a local civil action. He thinks if he establishes local jurisdiction first, he can complicate the federal case." He looked at Ethan. "He can't, but he doesn't know that yet." "And the court date?" "Friday, Judge Alderman, Laramie County Courthouse." Hargrove paused. "Mrs. Mercer will need to testify." "She'll testify," Ethan said. "She's been ready to testify since 1884. He rode back to Red Hollow, and he told Abigail, and she sat with it for a moment. The same stillness he'd seen in her on the first day on the train platform, when she'd looked at his broken fence and his unpaid notices, and hadn't flinched. And then she said, "Good." "You're not afraid?" he asked. She looked at him. "I'm terrified," she said. "But I didn't come all the way to Wyoming to go home with the job half done." He looked at her across the kitchen table. This woman who had come to him with one worn suitcase and a plan and 47 documents and a name that belonged to her mother. And he thought that he had spent 34 years on this earth, believing that the kind of strength he'd needed to build and to survive required absolute solitude, that to need anyone was to hand them the instrument of your own destruction. He had been wrong. He had been wrong for 34 years, and it had taken a mail-order bride with better accounting skills than him and more courage than anyone he'd known in the war to show him how completely he'd been wrong. "Whatever happens Friday," he said, "I'm standing next to you." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't," he said. "That's why I'm doing it." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once and picked up her pencil and went back to preparing her testimony, and Ethan went to clean his saddle and his boots, and the one good coat he owned, because Friday was coming, and Walter Bishop was about to find out what happened when you picked a fight with a woman who had been patient long enough. Friday arrived the way hard days always do, without ceremony, without warning. Just the same cold light coming through the same window, and the knowledge that something was going to end today one way or another. Ethan was up before dawn. He heard Abigail in the kitchen before he reached it. The fire already built, the coffee already on, and her sitting at the table with her testimony notes spread in front of her. Reading them the way a soldier checks his weapon before a battle. Quietly, thoroughly, without drama. He sat down across from her. She poured his coffee without looking up. "How many times have you read those?" he asked. "Enough," she said. "You nervous?" She looked up at him then. "Yes," she said. "But not about the evidence. The evidence is solid." She folded the notes and put them in the inside pocket of her coat. I'm nervous about what happens if it doesn't matter. If Bishop's lawyers find a procedural angle we haven't anticipated. If Judge Alderman is cooperative. She said the word carefully. Alderman's been on the bench in Laramie County for 18 years, Ethan said. He buried his brother-in-law's homestead claim 3 years back because the survey was off by 40 feet. He's not cooperative. She held his gaze. You sure? Tom Hadley introduced me to him at a county fair in 1882, Ethan said. The man ate a hard-boiled egg and argued land law for 40 minutes with a county commissioner who outranked him, I'm sure. Something in her face eased just slightly. She picked up her coffee. We should ride, she said. They rode. The Laramie County Courthouse in Casper was not a grand building, but it had the particular gravity of a place where real things had been decided, where families had won and lost, and been told the truth about their lives in plain official language, and where the weight of all those decisions had accumulated in the walls over years until you could feel it the moment you walked through the door. The courtroom was already half full when they arrived. Patrick Reardon was there with his son, whose jaw was still swollen from Wednesday night. Tom Hadley sat in the front row with his hat in his hands and his 81-year-old spine straight as a fence post. Jenny Alcott was there, and the Brennan brothers and 6 or 7 faces Ethan recognized from town people who had come not because they were summoned, but because they understood instinctively that this was the kind of morning you showed up for. Martha Briggs was there. She sat at the end of a row, and she looked at Abigail when they came in, and she nodded once a small, plain acknowledgement that cost her something, and that Abigail received with an equally plain nod back. Some things between women are settled without words in the space of a second, and both of them understood that this was one of them. Walter Bishop was already seated at the opposing table with Caldwell and 2 other attorneys Ethan didn't recognize. Continental's people most likely. Come up from Denver or Chicago to manage the situation. Bishop looked composed and unhurried, which Ethan now understood was simply what he always looked like. The man had a face built for courtrooms. He looked at Abigail when she came in, just for a moment, and in that moment, something passed between them, not hostility exactly. Recognition. 2 people who had been on opposite sides of the same machinery, looking at each other across a courtroom floor, and understanding that today the machinery was going to be taken apart. Judge Alderman came in at precisely 9 o'clock. He was a lean man of 60 with no patience for formality beyond what the law required, and he sat down and looked at the room over his reading glasses and said, I've reviewed the federal complaint filed Tuesday by Commissioner Hargrove's office. I've reviewed the consolidated civil filing from Mr. Mercer and the associated plaintiffs. And I've reviewed Continental Railroad's motion to establish local jurisdiction and dismiss the federal overlay. He set the papers down. Continental's motion is denied. We will proceed. Caldwell was on his feet before the words were finished. Your Honor, the federal complaint relies on documents of questionable provenance obtained by a former employee who has demonstrated a pattern of... Mr. Caldwell, the judge said without raising his voice. Sit down. You'll have your turn. Caldwell sat. Ethan felt Abigail exhale beside him, one slow, controlled breath, and then she was still again. The morning moved fast and brutal. Abigail took the stand at 9:30, and she testified for 2 hours, and she was the best witness Ethan had ever seen, precise, composed, never argumentative, answering every question with the exact amount of information required, and not a syllable more. She walked through the documents one by one. She explained the survey alterations in language a non-lawyer could understand. She identified the handwriting on the altered boundary notations as matching a specific drafter at Hartwell Associates, whose name appeared in Continental's own internal payroll records, which she had also copied. When Caldwell cross-examined her, he came at her from 4 different angles, and she was patient with every one of them. He suggested the documents were fabricated. She pointed out the originals had already been subpoenaed from Continental's archive by the Federal Marshal's Office and would be available for comparison. He suggested her motivations were personal, that she had a vendetta. She said, I have 47 documents and a sworn affidavit from the Federal Land Commissioner. If you'd like to discuss my motivations, I'm happy to, but I'd suggest the documents speak louder. Someone in the gallery laughed. The judge didn't suppress it. Caldwell tried one more angle. He looked at the jury. This was a civil proceeding. No criminal jury, just the judge. But there was a gallery full of people watching, and Caldwell understood the difference between the legal outcome and the public one, and he was still fighting for the public one. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "isn't it true that you came to Red Hollow specifically to manufacture this situation, that you identified the Mercer property as a target, inserted yourself into the household under false pretenses, and constructed this entire narrative for your own purposes?" The courtroom was very quiet. Abigail looked at Caldwell. She didn't look at Ethan, though he was watching her from the gallery with his hands loose in his lap and his face entirely still. "I came to Red Hollow," she said, "because I knew what was being done to families here, and I was the only person with the evidence and the knowledge to stop it." She paused. "Everything else that happened while I was there that was real. And it's none of your business." The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Caldwell, do you have substantive questions for this witness?" Caldwell looked at his notes. He shuffled them. He set them down. "Nothing further, Your Honor." The gallery exhaled. The afternoon session was where it broke open. The federal marshal, a man named Tate, who had ridden from Cheyenne and arrived that morning looking like a man who had opinions and the authority to act on them, took the stand and presented the findings of the federal investigation that had been running apparently for the 3 days since the complaint was filed. Continental's Wyoming operation, it turned out, had not been careful enough. The same schemes that had worked in Nebraska and Colorado had left the same paper trail in Wyoming, and once someone had handed the federal government a map of where to look, the trail was not difficult to follow. 17 properties. Not 4. 17 across 3 counties targeted over 26 months using the same methods, the same shell company structure, the same altered surveys. 9 completed acquisitions. 8 still in contest. Every single one of them involving Meridian Holdings, which was documented in Continental's own internal communications as a strategy vehicle for maintaining legal distance from the parent company. When Tate finished, the courtroom was the quietest Ethan had ever heard a room full of people be. Walter Bishop sat at his table, and he looked for the first time since any of them had known him, like a man who understood that the move he'd made had been the wrong one, not the fraud that had been working for 2 years, and he'd had no reason to doubt it. The wrong move was the church hall meeting. The public exposure. Driving Abigail into the open when she'd been moving carefully had pushed her to act sooner and with more force than she might have otherwise. He'd accelerated his own destruction trying to stop her. He looked at Abigail once across the courtroom, and what was in his face was not anger. It was something colder than anger. The recognition of someone who has played a long game well and lost to someone who played it better. Abigail didn't look at him. Judge Alderman ruled at 4:15 in the afternoon. He was not a dramatic man, and his ruling was not dramatic. It was clear, complete, and legally precise in the way that made it nearly impossible to appeal. The fraudulent boundary modifications constituted actionable fraud against the property owners. The illegal fence enclosure was a criminal trespass. The consolidated evidence was sufficient to refer the matter to the federal court for full proceeding against Continental Railroad's Wyoming operation. All competing claims filed by Meridian Holdings against properties in Laramie County were vacated pending federal review. All 9 completed acquisitions were flagged for potential reversal. The gallery did not erupt. It exhaled all of it at once like a room that had been holding its breath for years, and then it got loud. The good kind of loud. The kind that means people are crying and shaking hands and saying things that don't make sentences but mean everything. Tom Hadley put his hat back on his head and stood up from the front row and looked back at Ethan and said loud enough for half the room to hear, "Your daddy would have been real proud today, boy." Ethan looked at the old man. He didn't trust himself to say anything. He nodded. He looked at Abigail. She was still at the witness table, gathering her notes, her back to the gallery, her hands moving with the same efficient precision they always moved with. But her shoulders, he'd learned to read, her shoulders were different. The set of them. The particular way she held herself when she was maintaining composure over something that was working to break through. He crossed the courtroom. He came to stand beside her, and she looked up at him, and whatever she'd been holding back was very close to the surface. Now her eyes bright, her jaw tight, the expression of a woman who has spent so long being careful that she's almost forgotten how to be anything else. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He didn't think about it. He put his arms around her, and she stood still for exactly 1 second, surprised or bracing or both. And then she leaned into him, and he felt the breath go out of her. The long-held, careful breath of a woman who has been carrying something enormous for a very long time and has finally set it down in safe hands. He held on. In the middle of a Laramie County courtroom with Tom Hadley and Martha Briggs, and the Brennan brothers, and the federal marshal, and 2 of Continental's attorneys, all watching, Ethan Mercer held on to his wife and did not let go, and he did not care one single bit what any of them thought about it. They rode home in the late afternoon light with the rest of them, Tom and Patrick and Jenny and the others, a loose group spreading out along the road back to Red Hollow, nobody in any hurry. Now the urgency of the past week draining out of all of them into the simple fact of being headed home with the thing settled. Ada Tolliver met them at the edge of town, and she had apparently been cooking since morning, because there was supper at the church hall for anyone who wanted it, and everyone wanted it. The town ate together for the first time in longer than most of them could remember, and nobody talked about Bishop, and nobody talked about Continental, and nobody said the word railroad once the whole evening. What they talked about was spring, the planting that needed doing, the fence repairs, the Riordan boy's jaw which was healing clean, the price of beef in Casper and whether it would hold through summer. The small, ordinary, necessary business of people who intend to stay somewhere and need to plan accordingly. Abigail sat beside Ethan, and she was quieter than usual. But it was a different quiet from the one he'd first known in her, the careful, managing quiet of a woman keeping things behind a wall. This was something more settled. A quiet that didn't need explaining. Martha Briggs sat across from her at one point and said, "I owe you an apology. A proper one, not just a nod across a courtroom." "You don't owe me anything," Abigail said. "I do," Martha said firmly. "I was afraid of what you represented, someone coming in from outside with more knowledge than us. I made that into something suspicious when it wasn't." She met Abigail's eyes. "You fought for this town harder than half the people in it. I'm sorry it took me this long to see that." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "You wrote to Boston because you were worried about Ethan," she said. "I understand that. I was wrong to do it without talking to you first." "Yes," Abigail said. "You were." She picked up her cup. "But you brought the telegram when it mattered. That's the one that counts." Martha looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, and something between them settled definitively, and without further ceremony, the way honest things do. They rode back to the ranch late, just the 2 of them, the horses slow and easy, with no urgency in them any more, the sky enormous overhead. Red Hollow's lights faded behind them, and the road opened up into the dark Wyoming plain, and Ethan breathed the cold air and felt it go all the way down clean and real. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. Abigail rode beside him close enough that their stirrups almost touched. "What do you mean?" "The reason you came. It's finished." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "You don't have to stay." She was quiet for long enough that he felt the weight of it. Then she said, "Are you asking me to leave?" "No," he said. "I'm asking what you want." She turned to look at him, and the starlight was enough to see her face, and what was in it was the plainest thing he'd seen from her since the day she'd arrived. No strategy, no management, no careful measured distance. "I want to fix the east window," she said. "The one that lets in the cold air. I've been thinking about how to do it for 6 weeks, and I have a method that should work." She paused. "And I want to see what the eastern pastures look like in the spring. Nobody's described them to me, and I think they're probably worth seeing." Another pause shorter. "And I want to keep eating supper across from you. That's what I want." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. She let him. Her fingers closed around his firm and certain, and they rode the rest of the way home like that, side by side in the dark, with the ranch light coming up ahead of them through the cold. 3 months later, spring came to Red Hollow the way it always did after a hard winter tentative. At first, then all at once, as though the land had been waiting for permission, and finally decided to stop asking. The eastern pastures went green. The creek ran clean through the unfenced boundary, the illegal posts long since pulled and hauled away. New cattle moved through the far fields, fewer than before the drought, but healthy, and the fence lines Ethan and Abigail had repaired through February stood solid against the April wind. The federal case against Continental Railroad was still working its way through the courts. It would be years before it fully resolved. But 2 of the 9 acquired properties had already been returned to their original owners, and the remaining 7 families were fighting with federal backing now, which was a different kind of fighting entirely. Walter Bishop had left Wyoming in February. Nobody knew where he'd gone, and nobody in Red Hollow spent much time wondering. On a quiet evening in late April, Ethan came in from the far pasture and found Abigail on the porch with her face turned toward the last of the light. She'd been doing that more lately, taking a moment at the end of the day just to stand still and be somewhere. He understood it. He'd started doing it himself. He sat down beside her on the porch step. He reached into his coat pocket and he held out what he'd been carrying for 3 days, waiting for the right moment. A small carving, no bigger than his thumb, rough cut from the elm wood he'd taken from the fallen tree at the creek boundary last month. A bird, wings slightly spread, head tilted as though listening. A meadowlark. The first one had returned to the eastern pasture that morning, and he'd heard it from the fence line, and he'd stood there and listened to it for longer than he could account for. Abigail looked at the carving. She picked it up and turned it in her hands, and her face did the thing it did, now sometimes went unguarded and quiet, and fully present without the careful management she'd carried for so long. "You made this," she said. "My father taught me," he said. "I hadn't done it in years." He watched her hands on the small carved bird. "First one came back to the east pasture this morning. Heard it singing before I saw it." He paused. "Figured it was worth marking." She looked at him. He said, "I spent years protecting this land. Every fence, every filing, every season. I thought that was the whole of it." He looked at her directly the way she'd always looked at him, steady, plain, without apology. "You're the first thing that ever made it feel like home." She held his gaze for a long moment. Her hand closed gently around the small carved bird. Then she leaned her shoulder against his, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together on the porch in the fading April light. 2 people who had come to each other with nothing but desperation and old wounds, and more courage than either of them had known they possessed, and they watched the sun go down over the Wyoming hills in the particular rich silence of people who have finally stopped waiting for the next bad thing and have started carefully, gratefully to believe in what's in front of them. The ranch had survived. But more than that, it had become something neither of them had dared to plan for when this all began. It had become a place where 2 broken-guarded, stubborn people had set down everything they'd been carrying and found that what remained, once all that weight was gone, was each other. And that in the end was the only deed that truly mattered. The one no court could contest, no company could buy, and no winter could take away.